For 12 years, I was the reason Hargrove Hotels never had a bad quarter. Not the brand, not the name on the building, not the smile in the lobby. Me. My systems, my spreadsheets, my 2 a.m. phone calls with vendors in 3 time zones, my color-coded contingency plans that nobody else understood well enough to follow. And then Owen Hargrove looked me in the eye across the conference table and told me his fiancée would be stepping into a leadership role in operations. I asked him which role, specifically. He said mine. I handed him my master key card, the one that controlled every property management system across 11 hotels in 6 states. The one that, once deactivated, would trigger a cascading lockout I'd built into the infrastructure 3 years ago as a security protocol. You have about 45 minutes, I told him, before the reservation system goes dark. Tell your father I said good luck with the wedding. I was 31 years old, and I had just ended a 12-year chapter of my life by walking out of a glass-walled conference room in downtown Nashville while Owen fumbled for his phone. But to understand why that moment felt less like destruction and more like gravity finally doing its job, you need to understand what I built, what I gave up to build it, and why the people who benefited most from it never saw it until it was gone. I was 19 when I walked into Hargrove's flagship property on 2nd Avenue for an internship interview. My aunt worked in housekeeping there, which is how I even knew the position existed. The lobby had this warm amber lighting that made everything look expensive, and I remember thinking I didn't belong there in my thrift store blazer and my scuffed flats. Edward Hargrove interviewed me himself. That surprised me. He was in his 60s, built like someone who'd done real physical work before he made money, with calloused hands and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead like he kept forgetting they were there. He didn't look at my resume for very long. He asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I knew how to learn something from scratch. The second was whether I could keep a secret. I said yes to both. He hired me on the spot, starting in reservations coordination. $6 above minimum wage, which in 2012 felt like a fortune. Within 3 months, I'd rewritten the internal tracking spreadsheet at the front desk used for group bookings. Within 6 months, Edward had moved me into a role that didn't have a title, just responsibilities that kept expanding like something alive. I stayed. Years went by in the way years do when you're building something. You look up and a decade has passed, and your identity is fused completely with the work. I created what we internally called the Grid, a proprietary operations management system that tied together reservations, housekeeping rotation, maintenance scheduling, vendor contracts, event coordination, and financial forecasting for all 11 Hargrove properties. It wasn't elegant by Silicon Valley standards, but it worked because I'd built it specifically for how Hargrove Hotels actually operated, not how some outside consultant thought they should operate. I was the only person who fully understood it. That wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a power grab. It was just the natural result of one person building something over 12 years without ever handing the keys to someone else, because for a long time there was no one else. Edward trusted me completely. He gave me the budget I asked for, protected my autonomy from the board, and showed up in my office with coffee on particularly brutal nights. When I worked through New Year's Eve 2 years in a row to handle double booking disasters, he wrote me handwritten thank you notes, not emails. Actual notes on his personal stationery. The relationship was professional, but it was also real. I knew his daughter's name, knew he'd built the first Hargrove property with inheritance money, and a bank loan he'd almost defaulted on twice. He knew I'd grown up in Clarksville, that my mom cleaned houses for a living, that I'd gotten this job because of my aunt and stayed because I wanted to prove I deserved to be there. He never made me feel like I had to prove anything. His son Owen was a different story. I'd met Owen 4 times over 12 years. Once at a company anniversary dinner where he'd spent most of the evening at the bar. Once at a board meeting he showed up to 20 minutes late and left early from. Once when he needed someone to cover a situation at the Memphis property and Edward told him to call me. Owen had called. I fixed it in 2 hours and he thanked me the way you thank a plumber. Efficiently and without any real interest in understanding what had actually been wrong. The 4th time was when Edward had his heart attack. It was a Tuesday in March. I was in the middle of renegotiating a linen supply contract when Edward's assistant called me, her voice thin and tight in a way that told me before she said the words. He'd collapsed in his office. Ambulance. Vanderbilt Medical. His son was already on his way from Atlanta. I drove to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours before anyone came out to talk to family. I wasn't family. I was just the person who had kept his company running for 12 years and needed to know if he was going to be okay. He was okay eventually, but he'd be in cardiac rehab for months. And in the meantime, Owen was flying in to take over. Owen arrived at Hargrove's Nashville office on a Thursday morning in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. He was 36 and looked like someone who had grown up understanding that the world existed to accommodate him. His handshake was the kind that communicates hierarchy rather than warmth. He smiled at everyone and meant none of it. On his arm was Ivy. Ivy Caldwell, 28 years old, with a degree in communications from a school I won't name, and a background that included 2 years as a lifestyle influencer, a brief stint as a brand ambassador for a skincare company, and no hospitality experience whatsoever. Owen introduced her as his partner and added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd be taking on a strategic advisory role in operations. Strategic advisory role. I remember writing the phrase on the legal pad I always kept in meetings, pressing harder than I needed to with the pen. That first week they were still in the getting-to-know-you phase. Owen held a lot of meetings. They were long and meandering and tended to end without clear decisions, just a general sense that things would be revisited. Ivy attended most of them, taking notes on her laptop with her head tilted slightly, like someone performing attention. She came to my office on a Friday afternoon. She knocked, which I appreciated, but then walked in before I'd said come in, which canceled it out. "I want to shadow you," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk like she'd been invited. "Owen thinks I should get the full picture of how operations actually work." I looked at her for a moment. She had the particular confidence of someone who had never been wrong about something that truly mattered. "The full picture takes about 12 years, I said. "I can give you an overview." She smiled. "That's perfect. Where do we start?" We started with the grid. I showed her the interface, explained the logic behind the property-level dashboards, walked her through how a maintenance flag at one hotel could affect housekeeping scheduling at another if they shared a regional vendor. She typed notes. She asked questions that were either very basic or completely off-topic, rarely anything in between. "Could this all just be in an app?" she asked at one point. "It is in an app. This is the app. I built it." She looked at her screen and then back at me. "I mean like something more user-friendly, more visual, like what guests see on the booking side." I explained carefully that the operations backend had different requirements than the customer-facing interface, that the complexity wasn't decorative, it was functional, that stripping it down to something more visual would mean losing the conditional logic that kept 11 properties from stepping on each other's scheduling. She nodded in a way that meant she'd heard me but hadn't absorbed anything. "I think there's a real opportunity here to modernize," she said. Those were the words that told me everything I needed to know. Over the following 6 weeks, Owen and Ivy systematically began dismantling what I had spent 12 years building, one confident, uninformed decision at a time. The first thing to go was the regional coordinator position. Felicity had worked for Hargrove for 9 years. She was the human glue between properties. The person who caught the things the system flagged but couldn't resolve on its own, who knew which vendors actually showed up on time and which ones needed a specific contact person to get things done. Owen called it redundant oversight. He let her go on a Wednesday with a 2-week severance and a handshake. Felicity called me that night. I was still in the office. 2 weeks, Nina, she said. Her voice was level, but I could hear what was underneath it. 9 years and 2 weeks. Nina, my name. I'd been Nina Calloway for 31 years and Nina from Reservations for 12 of them, and hearing her say it like that, like she was reminding herself I was a real person who would understand, made my chest tight. "I'm sorry," I said. "I tried. I had tried." I'd sent Owen a detailed memo the week before outlining why the regional coordinator role was load-bearing, not redundant. He'd replied with a single line. "Appreciate the perspective, Nina. Trust the process on this one. Trust the process." The phrase became his verbal signature. It appeared in emails, in meetings, in the Slack channels he'd created with names like Innovation Hub and Hargrove 2.0. Trust the process meant, I've made a decision without understanding what I'm deciding about, and I'd prefer you not explain why I'm wrong. Ivy began holding experience workshops for front desk staff. I attended one out of curiosity. She talked about energy, about making guests feel seen, about the importance of authentic luxury. All of it was true in the abstract, and none of it was applicable in the specific. What she didn't talk about was how to handle a double-booked executive suite on a Saturday night when there's a conference in-house and the nearest comparable property is 40 minutes away. That was grid knowledge. That was 12 years of building decision trees for exactly those situations, but the grid was being evaluated. Owen had brought in a consulting firm, 2 analysts in their late 20s who'd never worked in hospitality, to assess whether the system was scalable and future-ready. They spent a week poking around the back end and produced a 20-page report that recommended migrating to a third-party property management system with a built-in app interface, the kind used by mid-sized chains. The kind built for hotels that didn't have 11 properties with overlapping vendor relationships and 12 years of customized scheduling logic. When I read the report, I underlined the sentence that said, "Existing system appears to rely heavily on institutional knowledge held by a single operator, creating unnecessary operational risk." I underlined it 3 times. Then I opened a new document on my personal laptop, the one I didn't store anything Hargrove related on, and I started writing. I documented everything. Every warning I'd given in writing, every decision that had been made over my objection, every incident report from the weeks since Owen took over, the vendor miscommunications, the scheduling gaps at the Knoxville property, the event booking overlap at the Franklin location that had resulted in a corporate client threatening to cancel a $180,000 contract. I told myself I was building a record, documentation in case things needed to be explained later. But I also knew I was building something else. The calendar invite arrived on a Monday morning. My name, Owen's, Ivy's, and someone named Stephanie from HR. 2 o'clock, conference room B. Quit check-in operational transition. Operational transition. I'd been in enough corporate meetings to know that quit check-in was the comfortable phrasing companies used when they didn't want the word termination in the subject line of an email that might later become evidence. I spent the morning working. There were 3 active situations that needed monitoring: a vendor dispute at the Memphis property, a group booking discrepancy at the Chattanooga location, and a maintenance issue in Nashville that was 2 days from becoming a guest-facing problem. I resolved all 3 before noon. Then I spent 2 hours doing something I'd never let myself consider before. The grid security architecture was something I'd built in year 9, after a vendor data breach at a competitor made everyone in the industry suddenly interested in access controls. I designed the authentication layer with a specific failsafe. If the master operator credentials, mine, were deactivated in the HR system rather than simply expired or transferred, the system would interpret it as an unauthorized termination event and initiate a security lockdown. All automated scheduling functions would pause. The property sync would halt. Anyone without transferred credentials would be looking at a live interface that showed them data but couldn't execute any commands. I'd included this in the technical documentation I filed with IT in year 9. Not hidden, not secret, filed inaccessible to anyone who'd thought to look. No one had looked. At 1:35 I cleaned out my desk in the way I'd been mentally preparing for weeks. The photo of me and my aunt at my college graduation, the small cactus I kept alive through 4 Nashville winters on a windowsill with almost no sun, a journal I'd used for work notes that had personal things written in the margins, my building keycard. I left the plant. At 2, I walked into conference room B. Owen was at the head of the table. Ivy was to his right. Stephanie from HR was in the corner, the way HR people always are in these meetings, positioned somewhere between participant and witness. "Nina, sit down," Owen said. I stayed standing. He blinked. People don't usually stay standing. It unsettled him, which was the point. "We've been doing a lot of thinking about the direction of the company," Owen started. He had clearly rehearsed this, and we feel like the current operational structure, the way things are set up right now, isn't aligned with where Hargrove is going. We need someone who's more comfortable with change, someone who thinks in terms of innovation rather than maintenance. "Someone like Ivy," I said. Owen's jaw tightened. "This isn't about Ivy. You're replacing me with your fiancé, I said. I want to make sure we're describing it correctly. Ivy shifted in her seat. Stephanie from HR looked at her folder. We're restructuring, Owen said, louder now. Your position is being eliminated and the responsibilities are being redistributed. You'll receive 8 weeks severance and a reference letter. We need you to sign an NDA before you leave today. 8 weeks, 12 years. The math was so insulting it almost made me laugh. I reached into my jacket pocket and set my master key card on the conference table. You have 45 minutes, I said, checking my watch. It was 2007 p.m. After that, the grid is going to lock down every automated function across all 11 properties, group bookings, maintenance scheduling, housekeeping rotation, vendor sync. All of it will require manual override from the back end, which no one here knows how to do. Owen stared at the keycard. What are you talking about? IT has access. IT has read access. They can see the interface. They can't execute commands without the master operator credentials. Mine. I picked up my bag from by the door. There's a fail-safe built into the authentication layer. It's in the documentation I filed with IT in 2021. Section 4, Operational Security Protocol. You should probably start reading. Nina. Owen's voice cracked on my name in a way I'd never heard before. This is a felony. You can't sabotage. I didn't touch a thing, I said. I designed a security system. You terminated the person who ran it. The system is responding to your decision, exactly the way it was built to respond. That's not sabotage, that's documentation. I looked at Ivy once. She was gripping her phone with both hands, her face a shade paler than it had been. Good luck with the modernization, I told her. Then I walked out. I drove 4 blocks to a diner on Church Street that I'd been going to since I was 23. It had good coffee and a corner booth where the lighting was low enough that no one would notice if you sat alone for a while, not doing anything in particular. I ordered the Turkey Club and a coffee and sat down at 20:21 p.m. My phone started going at 2:34. Owen. Declined. Ivy. Declined. A number I didn't recognize, probably IT. Declined. Stephanie from HR. Declined. Stephanie from HR. Declined. I turned the phone face down and took a bite of my sandwich. At 2047, a text came through from an old colleague who still worked in operations at the Franklin property. Just 3 words. What is happening? Another from the Chattanooga front desk manager, someone I trained personally. System is down, Nina. Bookings won't process. We have 40 people checking in an hour. I read them both and set the phone down. This was the part I hadn't let myself think about too carefully. The guests, the staff, the 40 people checking in Chattanooga who had nothing to do with Owen's arrogance or Ivy's 6 weeks of experience workshops. They were just people who'd booked a hotel room. I stared at the parking lot outside the window for a while. Then I picked up the phone and sent one text to the Chattanooga manager. It was the manual override code for the local property backup, something I'd set up 2 years ago as a disaster recovery measure. It would let them process check-ins for the next 12 hours without the grid. It wouldn't fix anything at the corporate level, but 40 people could get their rooms. I don't know why I did that. Maybe because she'd been good at her job and this wasn't her fault. Maybe because some part of me still believed that the guests and the staff were separate from the destruction. At 3:15, Owen called again. This time I answered and put it on speaker. Tell me what you want. His voice had lost all the careful corporate composure. He sounded about 19. Money, title, equity, I don't care. Just come back and fix this. I drank my coffee. I don't want anything from you, Owen, I said. I want you to understand what you did. Not just to me, to every person in this company who actually knew what they were doing and got sidelined so you could hand authority to someone who doesn't. Ivy is 28 years old and she's never managed a hotel room, let alone 11 hotels in 6 states. That's not an insult. That's just true. I looked out the window at the street. Call your father. Tell him what happened. He deserves to hear it from you. I hung up. Edward called me at 4 p.m. from his rehab facility in Brentwood. I picked up on the second ring, Nina. His voice was thinner than I remembered. Cardiac rehab had taken something out of him. Or maybe it was the phone call he'd just gotten from his son. Tell me everything. So I did. All of it. The 6 weeks, the consulting report, Felicity's 2-week severance, the grid lockdown, the 45 minutes. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he said, "I'm so sorry. I should have been more careful with the transition. I should have put guardrails in place before I—" He stopped, collected himself. I gave him the keys without making sure he knew how to drive. "Yeah," I said. "You did." That was a harder thing to say than I expected it to be. Because I'd loved working for Edward, respected him, genuinely, in a way I hadn't fully understood until I was saying it out loud in the past tense. "What do you need?" he asked. "Nothing from you," I said. "But there's an envelope in the credenza behind your desk in Nashville, the one you keep locked. Inside there's a folder labeled Grid Recovery. It has full instructions for your IT team to rebuild the authentication architecture from scratch. It'll take them about 72 hours. You should be operational by the weekend." A long pause. "You wrote that." "I wrote it in 2022 in case I was ever in an accident. I updated it every 6 months." I let that sit for a second. "I always planned for my absence. I just didn't plan for yours." He exhaled, something between a breath and a sound I didn't have a name for. "And Owen?" he asked quietly. "That's your decision," I said. "He's your son." But I'll tell you what I told him. Everyone who stayed and did the work deserves better than what he gave them. You should figure out who's still there and make it right. I hung up and paid my check. The turkey club had been good. The coffee was better than what we had at the office. I'd been eating burned Keurig coffee for 12 years and not fully registering it. It took Edward 4 days. Owen was removed from his acting CEO role on a Friday, quietly, with a statement to the staff about a leadership transition and a return to the founding family's direct oversight. Ivy's advisory position was eliminated the same day. I heard later that she didn't take it well. I also heard she started a private members community online about navigating toxic workplaces, but I only know that because someone sent me the link without comment. Edward brought Felicity back, offered her a raise and an expanded title. She accepted. By the following Monday, the grid was mostly restored. The IT team had followed the recovery instructions and rebuilt the authentication layer with 3 redundant operator credentials instead of 1. They called me twice during the process with questions. I answered both calls. I don't know exactly why I did that either. Maybe because the people on those calls were just doing their jobs. I had 11 job offers within 3 weeks. From competing hotel groups who'd heard about what happened through the industry grapevine and apparently interpreted "woman took down her company's operations on her way out the door" as a hiring recommendation. 2 from consulting firms, 1 from a hospitality tech startup that wanted me to build a scalable version of the grid for mid-market hotel chains, 1 from a staffing firm that wanted to represent me, and 1 from Edward. He called me personally. Not through a lawyer, not through HR. His voice was steadier by then, more like what I remembered. He offered me the CLO position, full decision-making authority over all 11 properties. No board interference, no oversight committee, just direct accountability to him. A salary that made my hand shake when I heard it. "I trust you completely," he said. "I always did. I just didn't formalize it the way I should have. I want to fix that." I told him I needed to think about it. I took the startup offer instead, not because Edward hadn't been sincere. He had been, but because going back to Hargrove would mean spending the rest of my career in the shadow of what had happened there. Every decision I made would be read through the lens of the 45 minutes, and more than that, if I went back, I was telling myself that the only place I could be valued was the place that had originally failed to protect me. That felt like the wrong lesson. The startup was called StayOps. Small team, smart people, a genuinely interesting problem. How do you build operations management software that works for hospitality businesses that aren't big enough to have someone like me on staff, but complex enough to need the functionality? I became their director of product architecture. I built the thing I wish someone had handed me when I was 19 and starting from scratch. I kept different hours, left at 6 most nights, started cooking actual dinners instead of eating whatever I could find in a hotel staff break room. Bought furniture for my apartment that wasn't just functional, actually picked it out based on whether I liked it, started taking a pottery class on Thursday evenings, which sounds like exactly the kind of thing someone says when they're performing having a life, but turned out to be genuinely satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with productivity. I called my aunt more. She was the one who'd gotten me that internship interview 17 years ago. She'd never made a big deal of it, but I thought about it more as I got older. She'd handed me the door without knowing what was on the other side of it. "You sound different," she told me on the phone one Sunday. Good different. Like you're actually resting somewhere, instead of just pausing. I thought about that phrase for a long time. Just pausing. That's what 12 years had felt like. One long pause between crises. One long holding of breath. I wasn't holding it anymore. Edward recovered well. His doctors cleared him for limited work in the fall, and he came back into the office part-time. The company stabilized. New management structure, clear succession planning, multiple people trained on every critical system. He sent me a note, handwritten on his personal stationery, the way he'd always done it, that said he was proud of what I'd built and sorry he hadn't protected it better. He asked if we could have lunch sometime. I wrote back and said yes. We met at a restaurant near his office on a Thursday afternoon in October. He looked older but okay, the kind of okay that's real rather than performed. He asked about stay-ups. I asked about the properties. We talked like two people who'd worked through something difficult and come out the other side still capable of being in the same room. He said, "I still don't fully understand why you didn't come back." I thought about how to explain it, because I needed to know I could build something somewhere else, I said. Not just maintain something I'd already built. If I came back to Hargrove, I'd always wonder. He nodded slowly. "And do you know?" "Yeah," I said. "I do know." I said, "I do now." I heard about Owen and Fragments over the following year. He'd gone back to Atlanta, got a position at his father-in-law's commercial real estate firm, starting in something called Associate Development, which I understood to mean entry level. From people who knew people, I heard he was quieter now, less certain about things. I got a message from him on LinkedIn about 8 months after I'd left. I stared at it for a long time before I opened it. It was 2 paragraphs. He said he'd spent a long time being angry at me, before he understood that his anger was misplaced. He said he'd started to recognize, slowly, that what happened at Hargrove wasn't something that had been done to him. It was the consequence of decisions he'd made without the information to make them correctly. He said he was sorry, not for firing me, exactly, for not listening when listening might have prevented all of it. I read it 3 times. I didn't write back, not because I was still angry. I wasn't, not really, but because I realized I didn't need to. His apology was his to give. My response wasn't required for it to mean something or for me to be okay. I closed the app and went back to the code review I'd been doing. There's a thing that happens when you spend a long time being indispensable. You start to confuse it with being valued. They're not the same thing. Being indispensable means the work can't function without you. Being valued means the people in charge understand what you're doing and protect your ability to do it. Edward did both for a long time. Owen inherited the first and never understood the second. And for 12 years I let myself be indispensable without asking hard enough whether I was also valued. That's not Owen's fault, and it's not Edward's. It's mine. I don't say that to be gracious. I say it because it's actually true, and understanding it is the only reason I'm not still angry about the whole thing. I was 31 when I walked out of that conference room. I'm 33 now, and I'm still learning how to be a person outside of work, which sounds like a small thing, until you realize you've never really done it before. Last spring, I took a week off and drove up to the Smoky Mountains with my aunt. We rented a cabin outside Gatlinburg and hiked the same trail twice, because the first time we talked the whole way through and she wanted to actually see the trees. She's 64 and hikes faster than I do, which I'm choosing not to make a metaphor for anything. We sat on the porch one evening, watching the light go out of the sky, and she said, "Your grandmother would have liked this. She always wanted to get up into the mountains." I didn't know that about my grandmother. She died when I was 12. There's a lot I didn't learn about her because I spent most of my 20s at work. That's the thing about building systems. You can architect everything, redundancies, fail-safes, contingency plans for situations that haven't happened yet. You can make sure that the work doesn't depend on any single point of failure, but you can't get back the evenings. You can't recover the conversations that didn't happen because you were in a server room or a hotel back office or a conference call at 11 at night about a vendor dispute in Memphis. I'm not saying the work wasn't worth it. It was. I'm proud of what I built. I'm proud of how it held together and why it fell apart and what I did in the 45 minutes between. I'm just saying I also missed a lot of Thanksgivings. And maybe the real infrastructure worth building is the one that means something when the job is gone. If this story landed for you, if you've ever been the person who held everything together while someone else took the credit, hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in that conference room, and subscribe to Norina Tales so you don't miss what comes next. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that happened. Not the 45 minutes, not the lockdown, not Owen's press statement or Ivy's deleted social media. The cause was something quieter and further back than any of that. Edward built something real. He earned it slowly, with the kind of work that leaves calluses. And somewhere along the way, he made the very human mistake of assuming that because he understood what he built, the people who came after him would too. He handed Owen a company without first handing him comprehension. That gap between inheriting something and understanding it is where everything fell apart. Not because Owen was evil, he wasn't. He was just a person who had never been required to earn anything, placed suddenly in charge of everything, and given no honest accounting of what he didn't know. Ivy wasn't the problem either. She was a symptom. When someone with no relevant experience gets handed authority over people who have spent years developing it, that's not Ivy's failure. That's a leadership failure. That's what happens when the person making appointments values loyalty over competence and comfort over truth. And me, I made my own version of the same mistake for 12 years. I let myself become indispensable without ever asking clearly enough whether I was also protected. Those are two completely different things. I knew the grid inside and out. I could hold the whole operation in my head at any given moment. But I never pushed Edward hard enough to formalize what I'd built. Never demanded that the architecture be documented publicly, trained broadly, understood by more than one person. I told myself it was because the work was too complex. The real reason was that being the only one who understood it felt like security. It wasn't. It was a trap I'd built for myself and called a career. Here's what I actually believe about how things work. Stripped of any borrowed wisdom or borrowed framework, what you put out eventually comes back around, not as punishment or reward in any cosmic sense, but as consequence. Owen dismissed 12 years of expertise in a single afternoon and lost an operational system he didn't know he couldn't rebuild. Edward trusted blood over merit and watched the company he'd spent a lifetime building crack in under 2 months. I gave everything to a job without asking for the protections that would have made that giving sustainable, and I ended up losing the position I'd sacrificed everything to hold. None of those outcomes were random. All of them were the direct result of choices, some made in conference rooms, some made quietly over years, some made in the margins of a life that deserved more attention than I gave it. What saved me in the end wasn't the 45 minutes. It was the decision I made afterward not to go back. That took a different kind of strength than walking out. Walking out was anger and adrenaline and 12 years of compressed frustration, finally finding the door, staying out, turning down Edward's offer, building something new at a place that hadn't already seen me at my lowest. That took something steadier. It took the willingness to bet on myself in a context where no one already knew what I was worth. I think that's the thing worth carrying out of a story like this. Not the revenge, not the 45 minutes. The part where I had to decide alone in a new office with a blank calendar, and nobody's expectations to manage, whether I actually believed I was worth starting over for. I did. It turned out I was right.